The Cry in the Mansion. The Bennett Mansion in Beverly Hills was a place of silence, too silent for a home that should have been full of laughter, footsteps, and the carefree shouts of a child. The walls stretched high and wide, decorated with polished wood and gleaming marble, with crystal chandeliers hanging like captured starlight from the ceilings. Everything about the house whispered of wealth and power. Yet beneath the luxury was a stillness that unsettled anyone who stayed long enough to notice it. That stillness had grown stronger in the 2 years since Patricia Bennett, wife of millionaire Daniel Bennett and mother to their only son, Matthew, had died in a car accident. The house had never been the same, and neither had the boy who lived within it. At just 8 years old, Matthew was trapped in a wheelchair, his legs growing weaker by the day, his spirit even weaker than his body. On her third day of work, Ava Johnson, a new maid hired through an agency, noticed that silence pressing against her. She had started that morning with her usual determination, scrubbing the wide staircase until the marble shone, dusting the glass cabinets in the dining hall, and now she was bent on her knees in the upstairs corridor, carefully collecting Lego, blocks scattered on the thick carpet. The late afternoon sun spilled through the tall windows, painting golden lines across the hallway. She was humming quietly to herself, a tune she remembered from Sunday church when a sharp cry ripped through the calm like a blade. It was a scream, high-pitched and desperate, followed by a broken plea. "I don't want to. Please stop." The voice was a child's. Ava froze, her hand tightening around the red Lego block she had just picked up. She turned toward the end of the hallway, where a door was slightly ajar. The sound had come from there. The boy's sobbing voice echoed again, and Ava's chest tightened. She already knew who it was. Matthew. Ava rose to her feet, brushing the dust from her knees. She hesitated only for a second before moving quickly toward the door. She knocked gently, twice. There was no reply. Instead, she heard another muffled sob, choked by pain. Her instincts gave her no choice. She pushed the door open, and what she saw inside made her heart lurch. In the middle of the spacious bedroom, Matthew sat at the edge of his bed, his hands gripping the mattress so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Standing beside him was a tall woman in a white coat, his private physical therapist, Dr. Veronica Marks. Her hair was perfectly tied back, her face stern, her eyes sharp with irritation, as she pressed Matthew's legs into a deep bend. Sweat dripped from her temples, but her voice was steady, almost cruel. "No pain, no gain," she said flatly, her hands forcing the boy's fragile knees further. "If it doesn't hurt, it doesn't work. Keep going." Tears streamed down Matthew's face. "It hurts. I don't want to anymore, please." "Excuse me," Ava said softly, her voice careful as she stepped into the room. "May I come in?" The therapist snapped her head around, clearly annoyed at the intrusion. Her eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" "I'm Ava Johnson, the new maid. I heard the boy crying and—" "So you were hired to babysit, not to question." "My expertise." Veronica cut her off sharply. She turned back to Matthew and kept pressing on his legs as though Ava had never spoken. "If we stop every time he whimpers, he'll never recover." Ava glanced at Matthew. His wide brown eyes were wet with tears, fixed on her with a desperate plea. The look was more than fear. It was begging for rescue, for someone to believe his pain was real. Ava's heart broke in that instant. "Could you ease up just a little?" Ava asked gently, taking a small step forward. "He's in so much pain." Veronica scoffed without turning. "Do you have a degree?" "I studied at Johns Hopkins. I did my fellowship at Mayo. This family pays me $12 grand a month for my expertise. Do you even understand muscle atrophy? His muscles are wasting from disuse. If we don't push past the limit, he will never walk. He's not lazy," Ava replied, her tone quiet but firm. "He's scared. Fear isn't weakness. Sometimes fear needs comfort before it can give courage." The therapist finally released Matthew's legs and let him drop into his wheelchair with a thud, almost as if to prove a point. "That's enough for today. Tomorrow we continue, and tomorrow he will cooperate. whether he likes it or not. During my sessions, you are not allowed in this room." Without waiting for a reply, Veronica swept past Ava and out the door, her heels striking the polished floor with every step. The silence left behind was heavy. Matthew sniffled, wiping his cheeks with the back of his hand. Ava lingered in the doorway, her hands clasped together, unsure if she was allowed to step closer, yet knowing that even her presence had given the boy something the therapist never could: hope. "Matthew," she said gently, tapping lightly on the door frame. "May I come in now?" The boy didn't object. He gave the smallest of nods, his lips pressed together, as if he feared speaking would invite the pain back. Ava entered slowly, her movements deliberate, and sat at the edge of the bed, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I'm Ava," she said, her voice soft. "I was outside the door. I heard everything. I'm sorry you had to hurt like that." Matthew's lips trembled. "I want my mom," he whispered. His voice cracked on the word. Ava's heart squeezed. She had read in the agency file that Patricia Bennett had died in a car accident, but hearing the boy say it in that broken voice was different. It was raw and unhealed. "I know you miss her," Ava replied carefully. "I didn't know your mom, but I know mothers. They love their children more than anything in the world. If she could see you right now, what do you think she'd want most?" Matthew wiped his nose with his sleeve. She'd want me happy." Ava smiled gently. "Exactly. And maybe we can find a little happiness, just enough to tell fear it doesn't win." She thought for a moment, then added, "Can we try a little test? No pain, just yes or no if you feel something." The boy nodded. Ava didn't pull down the blanket covering his legs. Instead, she placed 2 fingers lightly on his right foot, over the fabric. "Do you feel this?" "Yes," Matthew whispered. She moved to his left foot. "And here?" "Yes." "Good," Ava said, nodding. "Sensation isn't the same as walking, but it's the first step toward walking. We can go from feeling to twitching, from twitching to standing, from standing to small steps. One step at a time, no rush." Matthew's eyes lifted slightly, the first trace of curiosity sparking through his sadness. Ava noticed a family photo on the wall: Matthew, his parents, and a golden retriever on Santa Monica Beach. The boy in the photo was smiling, standing, tall between his parents. He barely looked like the same child before her now, small and pale in the shadow of grief. "In this room," Ava said softly, "you don't have to try hard. You only need to try. Trying hard is a duty. Trying is a choice, and I promise I won't let you hurt." The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Will you stay?" "I'll stay close by," Ava said, her voice steady. "Call for me any time." Heavy footsteps echoed on the staircase. Ava turned her head toward the sound. Daniel Bennett was home. She straightened the blanket around Matthew, her heart racing as she prepared to meet the man who had hired her. "Rest a little, warrior," she whispered to the boy. "Tomorrow we'll try some music." Matthew's eyes flickered with the faintest curiosity. "What music?" "The kind that makes your toes dance without asking," Ava said with a wink. For the first time in days, the boy gave a soft giggle. Ava smiled, then stood and closed the door behind her. At the foot of the stairs stood Daniel Bennett, tall, broad-shouldered, still wearing his work suit, his tie loosened, his expression heavy with exhaustion and suspicion. "Good evening, Mr. Bennett," Ava said respectfully. "Matthew's doing better tonight." Daniel studied her, his face unreadable. Ava braced herself for what she knew would come next. In her pocket was her small notebook filled with sketches, games, and gentle exercises she had learned from community centers and church groups back in South LA. She carried it everywhere, because within those pages was her belief that laughter, music, and patience could sometimes do more than all the harsh therapies in the world. Daniel's gaze narrowed. "Let's talk," he said finally, nodding toward the living room. "About my boy. About hope." Ava followed, her heart steady but her mind racing. She knew this conversation would decide whether she had the chance to help Matthew or be cast out before she could even begin. The clash of belief The living room of the Bennett mansion was designed to impress guests, but in that moment, it felt more like a battlefield of ideas waiting to collide. The high ceiling arched above like the inside of a cathedral, the vast windows framed by heavy curtains, the polished floors reflecting the golden glow of the lamps. At one end, Daniel Bennett stood beside the mantel, his tall figure framed against a painting of ocean waves, his hand gripping a glass of water with the tension of a man who had forgotten how to relax. At the other end, Ava Johnson stood with her small notebook pressed discreetly to her side, her uniform still crisp from a long day's work, her eyes steady but cautious. Between them stretched not just the wide rug covering the marble floor, but the gulf between two ways of seeing the world. Daniel, who trusted science, money, and expertise, and Ava, who trusted gentleness, trust, and the small courage of a child's heart. Daniel sipped from his glass, his jaw tightening. "You're a maid," he said bluntly. "Dr. Marks has board certification, years of study, treatment protocols that are proven. I pay her very well because she knows what she's doing. You're not competing with her degrees." "I don't want to compete with her degrees," Ava replied gently, her words unshaken. "I want to bring something she cannot bring. I'm talking about trauma-informed care, about building a bridge between the boy's body and his spirit. No pain first. Joy first. Then gently inviting movement. 10 minutes of dancing with chairs. 5 minutes of tiny steps disguised as games. No shouting, no pushing past the limit, no terror. Just trust, laughter, and small victories." Daniel set his glass down with more force than necessary, the sound sharp against the polished wood. "You think dancing cures paralysis?" His voice carried the edge of a man trying not to break under the weight of his own doubts. "I think laughter unlocks fear," Ava answered softly. "And when fear is gone, courage returns. Courage makes the body believe again. And there's no evidence of nerve damage in Matthew's case. Only evidence that he is terrified of the pain he associates with every attempt to move." Daniel's shoulders stiffened. "I don't want to raise false hope," he said, his voice quieter now, almost weary. "When hope breaks, the pain is worse than never having it." "I don't promise," Ava said firmly. "I only try. And if he falls, I'll be there to tell him that falling isn't shameful. Please, Mr. Bennett, give me one evening with Matthew as a borrowed mother. I won't promise anything. I'll just listen, soothe, and give him joy. No more, no less." For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. His eyes searched hers as if testing the truth in her face, as if weighing the cost of letting down the walls he had built so carefully since his wife's death. Finally, he nodded once. "One evening. No promises." "No promises," Ava repeated softly, her lips curving into a small smile of relief. That night, she returned to Matthew's room. The boy was lying under his blanket, his eyes wide open, his small hands clutching the edges as if the blanket could shield him from the world. The nightlight glowed gently in the corner, casting soft halos on the walls. Ava pulled up a chair and sat lower than the bed's edge, so she was looking up at him instead of down. She wanted him to feel taller, more in control. "I want to hear your story," she said softly. "From the beginning, the way you want to tell it." At first, Matthew hesitated, his lips trembling. Then slowly, haltingly, he began to speak. He told her about the rain the day of the accident, about his mother picking him up from school, about the sudden truck swerving into their lane, the metal crushing, the sound of glass breaking, the smell of smoke. He told her how his mother never opened her eyes again, and how he had been in the back seat, helpless. His voice broke when he whispered, "If I hadn't gone to school that day, she wouldn't have had to drive. If I had stayed home, maybe she'd still be alive." Ava shook her head firmly, her heart aching at the weight he carried. "No, Matthew. The crash was caused by a reckless driver, not by you. You're not powerful enough to cause accidents, and you don't need to carry that weight forever. No one can know the future. What you can control is today. One deep breath, one small smile, one toe twitch to music. Each little bit today is your power." She reached into her pocket and took out a small speaker. "Let's try something new," she said with a smile. dancing with chairs. You don't need to stand. Just wiggle your ankles to the beat. If it hurts, stop. If you're scared, hug your knees. If it's fun, let it be fun. She played a soul playlist, soft but rhythmic, filling the room with warmth. Matthew frowned at first, then slowly under the blanket one of his toes twitched to the beat. He scrunched his nose, then whispered, almost surprised, "My toes are dancing." "Excellent," Ava said warmly, her praise just loud enough to build him up without startling him. "We're not pushing harder. We're just enjoying more." The door cracked open slightly. Daniel stood there peeking in. His face was tight, caught between suspicion and wonder. "You okay, son?" he asked softly. Matthew looked at Ava, then back at his father and nodded. Daniel exhaled a sound that seemed to carry months of tension and stepped back. Ava turned to Matthew. "See? Your dad is learning too. He's not perfect at everything, but he loves you." For the first time in a long while, Matthew laughed softly, not out of mockery, not out of fear, but out of a small bubble of joy that filled the room. Ava tucked him into bed when the song ended, whispering stories about dinosaurs who loved blues music and superheroes afraid of needles. Matthew's laughter grew louder, and Ava felt her heart expand with quiet triumph. Later, when he had fallen asleep, Ava wrote in her notebook, "Day 1, borrowed mother. Trust is twitching." She closed the book, pressed it to her chest, and breathed deeply. Somewhere in the house, she thought she heard Daniel's footsteps pause outside the door before retreating again. The next morning, before Dr. Veronica arrived, Ava placed 4 small star stickers on the floor, forming a short path from the bed to the window. "When you're ready," she told Matthew, "all you need is to reach the first star. Not today is fine too, but the stars are waiting for you." Matthew gazed at them with wonder, as if they mapped a journey to a sky he had almost forgotten. At 9 o'clock, the heavy click of heels announced Dr. Veronica's arrival. She entered with her equipment bag, her voice sharp and commanding. "Good morning, Matthew. Today we'll stand for 12 minutes. No more 10. Matthew's face paled. He whispered, "I'm not sure." "All the more reason," Veronica snapped, pulling out a knee brace. "I'll count for you." She glanced at Ava. "You don't need to be here." Ava swallowed her protest. "I'll stay outside the door," she said gently. The session began, and with it came the harsh rhythm of Veronica's methods: knees forced into position, feet stretched beyond comfort, hips bent until Matthew groaned. Each time he whimpered, Veronica's reply was the same. "Keep going. Pain is normal. No threshold, no progress." By the 3rd minute, the boy's body shook with fear, his cries turning to sobs. From the hallway, Ava heard the faint crack of a joint shifting. It wasn't a break, but enough to freeze her chest. She knocked gently. "Can we stop a moment? He needs to breathe." Veronica's voice was sharp with anger. "You're interfering. He's panicking, not injured. There's no 30 seconds. This is the protocol." She hauled Matthew upright against the wall, his small body trembling. Violently. "Count 1, 2, 3. Enough!" Ava burst into the room, her voice steady with outrage she could no longer contain. "He's having a panic attack. Let him breathe." Veronica turned, her eyes blazing. "Get out!" She shoved Matthew back into the wheelchair, pulled out her phone, and dialed quickly. "Mr. Bennett, come home now. Your nanny is sabotaging treatment." 20 minutes later, the roar of an engine and the slam of a Porsche door echoed through the driveway. Daniel appeared at the bedroom threshold. Breathless, his tie loosened, his eyes flicking between the therapist and Ava. "What happened?" he demanded. Veronica stepped forward, her voice cold and professional. "She stormed in during the session, argued with me in front of the patient, frightened him, and disrupted the protocol. This is unacceptable." Ava knelt beside Matthew, who clutched her hand desperately. She didn't look at Veronica, only at Daniel. "I asked for 30 seconds because he was panicking. This morning, Matthew touched the first star sticker without pain. He can progress without being shoved through fear." "Star stickers on the floor," Veronica scoffed with a dry laugh. "Brilliant. Paper science. Daniel rubbed his temples, torn between two worlds, the measurable authority of degrees and fees, and the raw, undeniable fire in Ava's eyes. Finally, his voice cut the air. "Ava, I'm sorry, you're dismissed." "Dad!" Matthew burst into tears. "Don't fire Miss Ava, please." "This is our home," Daniel said stiffly, his tone more for himself than anyone else. "We respect professionals." Matthew sobbed harder, his body shaking. "I'm scared." Ava bent low, her voice steady, her heart breaking. "I won't leave you in spirit, Matthew, but I must go if your father says so. Remember the stars. Remember the music. Fear does not win." She stood slowly, her hands trembling, her eyes on Daniel. "You fear false hope, but pain like this will never grow real hope." Veronica's cold voice sliced through the moment. "Out. I still have work to do." Daniel's shoulders stiffened, his face carved with conflict. The silence that followed was more painful than any scream. Dismissal and defiance. The heavy silence that followed Daniel's words hung over the room like an iron weight. Ava remained still, her hands at her sides, her eyes fixed on the small boy trembling in his wheelchair. Matthew's tears streamed freely down his pale cheeks, and the way his small fingers clutched at her skirt tore at her heart. For a long moment Ava did not move. She had worked in many houses during her life. Wealthy homes, ordinary apartments, even crowded shared spaces where she had been hired for a day's cleaning. But never had she felt the same pull to stay as she felt. In that moment, everything in her wanted to kneel, hold Matthew close, and refuse to leave. But she also knew that the father's word in this house was law. Daniel Bennett had spoken, and his voice carried the unshakable authority of wealth, fear, and exhaustion. "I don't want her to go," Matthew cried again, his voice breaking as he reached for Ava. His tears were not only for her dismissal, but for something deeper, the same loss he had been reliving every day since his mother's accident, the fear of being abandoned again. Ava's chest ached, but she forced her voice to remain calm for him. She knelt beside him, wiping away his tears with the edge of her apron. "Listen to me, warrior," she whispered, her eyes locked on his. "You are not alone, even if I step outside this house. I will stay here." She touched her chest. "And here." She touched his small hand. "The stars we placed this morning, they don't vanish because someone tells us to stop. They are waiting. And when you are ready, you'll touch them again. You've already shown me courage. Don't forget it." Matthew sobbed harder, but there was a flicker of determination in his tearful eyes. Daniel's jaw tightened as he looked away, as though unable to face the raw emotion spilling from his son. Veronica, on the other hand, stood with her arms crossed, satisfaction glinting in her eyes as she repeated in her cold, clinical tone, "This disruption must end. If she goes, I can continue. If she stays, I cannot work. The choice is yours, Mr. Bennett." Daniel raised his hand, silencing her. "Enough," he muttered. His face was drawn, his shoulders slumped, but his decision remained firm. "Miss Johnson, I'll have the agency send someone else tomorrow. Thank you for your effort." Ava rose slowly, her hands trembling but her head held high. She placed her notebook on the nightstand, just beside the untouched pair of white sneakers that Matthew had not worn in 2 years. Her voice was steady when she said, "Mr. Bennett, I know you want what's best for your son, but sometimes the best isn't what's written in medical journals or shouted by professionals. Sometimes the best is simply what eases a child's fear long enough for courage to return. Think about what you saw tonight. His toes danced not because of pain but because of joy, and joy is not false hope." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. He did not reply, and Ava knew she had said all she could. She turned back to Matthew, brushing a curl of hair from his damp forehead. "I'll come back if you call me, even if only in your heart," she whispered. Then, with slow steps, she left the room, her back straight, though inside her chest felt heavy with sorrow. That night, after Ava had been dismissed from her duties, she did not leave the mansion. Immediately, she packed her few belongings quietly in the small guest room where she had been staying. folding her uniforms with deliberate care, though her mind was far from the task. Outside, the city lights of Beverly Hills glittered, but she felt no glamour in them. To her, they looked like distant stars, beautiful, unreachable, and indifferent. She sat on the edge of her bed, her notebook on her lap, her pen poised but unmoving. She wanted to write something, but the words refused to come. Instead, she stared at the single line she had written the night before. Day 1. Borrowed mother. Trust is twitching. Her chest tightened. Could one day really matter? Could one small flicker of trust in a child overcome the mountain of fear and pain that had grown inside him for years? She closed the notebook and pressed it against her heart, praying silently for strength. Meanwhile, in the master study downstairs, Daniel sat alone at his desk. The house was quiet. Veronica long gone for the evening, but the echoes of Matthew's sobs still clung to his mind. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, something he rarely allowed himself anymore, and stared at the untouched files spread before him. Contracts, investments, meetings, none of it held his attention. His mind returned again and again to the sight of his son twitching his toes to the rhythm of music, smiling despite himself. He had not seen that expression in so long that it almost felt like a dream. Yet just as quickly he remembered Patricia. His wife's face flashed in his memory, pale and still at the hospital, his hands gripping hers, his voice breaking as he promised to take care of their boy no matter what. That promise haunted him every day. He had promised to give Matthew everything he needed, and that promise had turned into money spent on the best therapists, the most advanced treatments, the most respected names in medicine. He had poured his wealth into his son's recovery, and yet 2 years later, the boy was still bound to a chair. The more money he spent, the more helpless he felt, and the more he clung to the cold assurance of professionals who told him that progress would come only through discipline and pain. But tonight, something different had happened. For the first time in years, Matthew had smiled. Daniel drained the glass, his thoughts restless. Could it be that the maid had seen something the doctors had missed? He shook his head, unwilling to admit such a possibility. Yet doubt had already slipped into the cracks of his certainty. Upstairs, Matthew lay awake in bed, his eyes swollen from crying, his hands clutching the blanket where Ava had sat. He whispered into the darkness, "Don't leave me, Miss Ava." His voice was too soft for anyone to hear, but in his heart, he imagined she could. The following morning, Ava returned her uniform, keys, and badge to the agency office, but her heart refused to leave Matthew behind. She kept the small notebook with her, flipping through the pages filled with games, exercises, and comforting words. Each page was a memory of children she had helped before, children from neighborhoods, forgotten by the city, children who had needed laughter more than medicine. She thought of her younger brother Jerome, who had been born with brittle bones. As a teenager, she had spent nights by his side singing to him, inventing silly games to distract him from the pain. He had died when he was only 15, his body too fragile to survive a final fracture. But before he died, he had told her, "You made me forget I was broken, even if just for a little while." That memory had stayed with her, shaping her into the woman she was now, determined to bring comfort where science had failed. That evening, as she returned to her small apartment in South Los Angeles, Ava sat by the window and looked at the notebook again. She could not return to the Bennett house by order, but she could not abandon the boy either. She decided to act quietly, carefully, in whatever way she could. She began writing letters addressed to Matthew, filled with encouragement and stories disguised as lessons. She slipped the first letter into an envelope with a drawing of stars, like the stickers she had placed on his floor, and left it with a trusted worker at the agency, asking him to deliver it discreetly the next time someone visited the Bennett home. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, Daniel noticed the absence of Ava almost immediately. The new maid sent by the agency was polite but distant, efficient but cold. She did her tasks without warmth, and though the house gleamed, it felt emptier than before. Matthew grew quieter, his eyes dull, his resistance to therapy stronger than ever. Veronica pushed harder, determined to break through his defiance, but the more she forced, the more the boy shrank. His cries grew louder, his body more rigid, his progress non-existent. One night, after a particularly harsh session, Daniel found his son curled in his bed, clutching the small envelope Ava had arranged to send. Inside was the letter she had written. "Dear warrior, I know today was hard. But remember, fear does not win. The stars are still waiting. Try to smile once tonight, even if it's small. That smile is your victory. Yours, Miss Ava." Beneath the words was a simple drawing of a star and a pair of shoes. Daniel's hands trembled as he read the letter aloud to his son, who listened with wide, tearful eyes. Something in those words struck Daniel's heart more deeply than he cared to admit. He saw the flicker of light in Matthew's face, the same flicker he had seen during Ava's music session, and for the first time he felt the nagging weight of doubt turn into something sharper: guilt. Had he dismissed the only person who had truly understood his boy? That guilt grew heavier with each passing day. Matthew received more letters, each one filled with stories, drawings, and encouragement. Ava wrote of dinosaurs who danced when they were afraid, of kings who learned to listen to their children, of warriors who fought fear with laughter. Each story carried a message, and Matthew treasured them as if they were magic spells against his pain. Daniel noticed. He noticed the way Matthew's eyes brightened when he read those letters, the way he whispered Ava's name before falling asleep. And though he told himself not to, Daniel began to wonder if perhaps he had made a mistake. The tension in the house grew unbearable. Veronica pressed for longer sessions, insisting that results required more intensity. While Matthew grew weaker and more resistant, Daniel found himself standing outside the door more often, listening to his son's cries, his own hands trembling with the urge to intervene. One night, after a session left Matthew nearly unconscious with exhaustion, Daniel confronted Veronica. "This isn't working," he said, his voice hard. "He's not progressing. He's suffering." Veronica straightened her coat, her tone sharp. "This is the process, Mr. Bennett. Pain precedes progress. If you doubt me, then you doubt science itself." Daniel's jaw tightened. For the first time, he found himself snapping back. Science is supposed to heal, not destroy. If this is science, then perhaps we need something else. He left her standing in the hallway, his mind racing. He walked to his study, poured himself another drink, and stared at the untouched sneakers in the corner of Matthew's room, the same ones Ava had noticed. They had been bought with hope, and hope had been left to gather dust. That night, Daniel whispered into the quiet house, "Patricia, what would you have wanted me to do?" The silence gave him no answer, but the memory of Ava's words echoed in his mind. Joy first. Fear needs comfort before it can give courage, and for the first time since the accident, Daniel wondered if perhaps the path to healing was not paved with money or degrees, but with something far simpler: gentleness. The breaking point, the days that followed Ava's dismissal, fell into a heavy rhythm inside the Bennett mansion, but it was not the rhythm of healing or progress. It was the rhythm of a boy's cries echoing against cold walls, of a father pacing the hallways with guilt pressing down on his chest, of a therapist whose voice grew sharper with every failed attempt at progress. Veronica Marks continued her sessions with the same rigid conviction, convinced that pushing Matthew harder was the only path to success. She came each morning with her equipment bag, her white coat, and her endless rules. But the more she forced, the more the boy resisted, his spirit curling inward like a leaf under frost. His body was weakening, but worse than that, his will to try was disappearing. Daniel watched all of this from a distance. At first he told himself that the discomfort was temporary, that the tears were a necessary price for eventual recovery. He reminded himself of the degrees, the reputation, the money he was pouring into treatment. But each time he stood outside his son's door and heard Matthew sobbing, his certainty cracked a little more. He began to notice things he had ignored before: the way Matthew's shoulders tensed at the sound of Veronica's heels on the floor, The way his eyes darted toward the door as if begging for escape. The way his body trembled not from effort, but from terror. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Daniel entered Matthew's room and found his son slumped in the wheelchair, his face pale, his lips dry, his eyes glazed with exhaustion. He looked like a boy who had fought a war he could not win. Daniel crouched beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his damp forehead. "Son," he whispered, his voice trembling despite his attempt at calm. "Do you want me to stop these sessions?" Matthew's lips parted, but his voice was barely a whisper. "I just want Miss Ava." The words cut Daniel deeper than any accusation could. He had dismissed her, told himself it was the logical choice. Yet here was his son, clinging to the memory of the one person who had given him comfort. Daniel's throat tightened as he realized that, despite all the money he had spent, despite all the professionals he had hired, the one who had reached his son's heart was not a doctor, not a therapist, but a maid. That night, Daniel sat in his study long after the rest of the house had gone silent. The whiskey glass sat untouched on the desk before him. He stared at the pair of small white sneakers in the corner of the room, the shoes his wife had bought 2 years ago with hope that Matthew would wear them again. They were still brand new, the laces crisp and clean, a cruel reminder of time, frozen. He remembered Ava's words. Joy first. Fear needs comfort before it can give courage. He remembered the sight of Matthew twitching his toes to the music, smiling despite himself. And he remembered the look in Ava's eyes when she had pleaded for one evening to bring joy instead of pain. In the quiet, Daniel whispered, "Patricia, if you were here, what would you tell me?" His voice cracked. "Would you tell me I've been blind? Would you tell me I've been clinging to the wrong things?" He closed his eyes, but no voice answered. Only the silence pressed heavier. The breaking point came 3 days later. Veronica had decided to increase the intensity of her sessions. She strapped Matthew's legs into rigid braces and tried to force him to stand against the wall for 15 minutes. The boy cried out immediately, his voice ragged with fear. "It hurts. Please stop," he begged, but Veronica's reply was sharp and merciless. "No pain, no gain. Stand or you'll never walk." His small hands clawed at the wall for support, his body trembling violently, his knees buckled, his breath came in short gasps, and then his head tilted back, his eyes rolling upward as he collapsed into the chair. For a terrifying moment he did not respond. Daniel, who had been standing at the door, rushed forward in panic. "Matthew!" he cried, shaking his son gently. Matthew's eyes fluttered open, dazed, his lips trembling. "I can't," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I can't do this anymore." Daniel turned to Veronica, fury blazing in his eyes. "Enough! This is over." Veronica straightened, her voice indignant. "He fainted from fear, not from injury. This is normal. If you stop now, you throw away all progress." "There is no progress," Daniel shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "There is only suffering. My son is not a laboratory experiment. He is a child." For the first time, Veronica faltered. Daniel's words cut through her practiced arrogance, but instead of backing down, she gathered her things, her voice icy. "If you dismiss me, Mr. Bennett, you will never find another therapist of my caliber willing to take this case." "Then I'll do without you," Daniel snapped. His hands trembled as he lifted Matthew into his arms and placed him gently in bed. "Get out of my house." Veronica stiffened, her face pale with rage, but she said nothing more. She swept out of the room, her heels clicking like a drumbeat of defeat. The slam of the front door shook the walls, leaving behind only silence. Daniel sat beside his son's bed, his face buried in his hands. For the first time in years, the man who had built an empire, who had commanded boardrooms and investors, felt utterly powerless. He had money, he had influence, but neither could buy what his son needed. He whispered again, "Patricia, forgive me, I don't know what to do." It was in that silence that Ava's voice seemed to echo in his memory. "I don't promise. I only try. And if he falls, I'll be there to tell him falling isn't shameful. The next morning, Daniel made a decision. He called the agency and demanded to speak to Ava directly. At first, they hesitated, reminding him that she had been dismissed, but his tone left no room for refusal. Within hours, Ava stood once more at the threshold of the mansion, her heart pounding, her small suitcase in hand. When Matthew saw her enter his room, his eyes lit up with a joy so pure that Daniel felt his throat tighten. "Miss Ava," the boy cried, his voice trembling with relief. He tried to sit up straighter, his hands gripping the blanket, his face breaking into the first genuine smile in weeks. Ava knelt beside him, her own eyes brimming with tears she had tried to hold back. "I told you, warrior," she whispered, brushing his cheek. "I'd come back if you called me." Daniel stood silently at the door, watching the reunion. He cleared his throat, his voice rough. "Miss Johnson, I owe you an apology. I dismissed you when you were the only one who saw my son, not just his condition. If you're willing, I'd like you to return. Not as a maid, as whatever he needs." Ava looked up at him, her gaze steady. "I'll come back," she said softly. "But I must do it my way. No pain first, joy first. We build trust before we build steps." Daniel nodded, his face solemn. "Do it your way. I've tried everything else." And so began a new rhythm in the Bennett mansion. Ava returned not as a servant, but as a guide, a companion, a borrowed mother. She filled Matthew's days with laughter, music, and games. She brought back the star stickers, placing them along the floor in small paths. She invented stories where each step was a victory, each twitch a triumph. She celebrated every tiny movement, no matter how small, until Matthew began to believe in himself again. Daniel watched from the sidelines, his heart torn between hope and fear. He saw his son smile, laugh, even dare to try. He saw Ava kneel beside him, patient and gentle, her voice never sharp, her praise never absent. Slowly, he began to believe too. The first breakthrough came one quiet afternoon. Ava had placed a row of star stickers from the bed to the window. Matthew sat in his chair, staring at them, his small hands trembling with anticipation. Ava knelt beside him, her voice calm. "You don't have to reach the last star, warrior. Just the first one. That's all. One star is enough." Matthew's lips trembled, but his eyes burned with determination. With Ava's hands steadying him, he gripped the edge of the bed and pushed himself upright. His legs wobbled, his knees shook, but he remained standing for a single miraculous moment. His toes brushed the first star sticker, and he gasped in, "Surprise!" "I did it," he whispered, his voice trembling with wonder. "Miss Ava, I touched it." Ava's eyes filled with tears as she hugged him gently, careful not to overwhelm him. "Yes, you did. You touched the star. And tomorrow maybe you'll touch another, one star at a time." Daniel, who had been standing at the door, covered his mouth with his hand, his eyes shining. For the first time in years, he felt a surge of hope that was not bought, not forced, not promised by professionals. It was simple, fragile, and real. His son had touched a star. The impossible made real. The days after Matthew touched his first star felt different in the Bennett mansion. The silence that had once weighed heavy on the air was now filled with something new, something fragile, but undeniable. It was hope, though Daniel still struggled to admit it aloud. For so long, he had depended on cold logic, on medical reports, on numbers and progress charts that showed nothing but decline. Now, without degrees or protocols, without machines or expensive treatments, his son had taken a trembling stand on his own two legs. The moment had been brief, but it was real, and Daniel could not forget the light that had burst into Matthew's eyes. Ava kept her promise. She never rushed, never demanded, never let pain be the measure of progress. Each morning, she drew back the curtains to let sunlight flood Matthew's room. She placed the star stickers on the floor in new patterns, sometimes leading toward the window, sometimes toward the bookshelf, sometimes in circles like constellations. She played music that made Matthew's toes wiggle before he even realized it, and she told him stories where heroes won not by being the strongest but by refusing to give up when they were afraid. Every evening she wrote a new line in her notebook, recording the small victories as if they were treasures. Day 2. Courage is standing for one heartbeat. Day 5. Courage is laughing even when afraid. Day 10. Courage is reaching for the second star. Daniel watched all of this quietly, his heart shifting in ways he could not explain. He still carried the weight of guilt, still feared disappointment, but each time he saw his son smile or laugh, each time he saw his boy try without breaking down in sobs, a piece of that weight lifted. He began to sit in on the sessions, at first in silence, then gradually becoming part of them. He placed stickers on the floor himself. He clapped when Matthew twitched his toes. He even tried dancing awkwardly to the music one evening, his large frame moving stiffly while Matthew laughed so hard he nearly fell from the bed. For the first time in years, father and son were not just enduring pain together. They were sharing joy. But progress was slow, and doubt remained Daniel's constant shadow. Some nights, when Matthew had gone to sleep and Ava had returned to her small room, Daniel would sit alone in his study, staring at the sneakers in the corner. He would run his fingers along the laces, untouched for so long, and whisper to his wife's memory. He stood, Patricia. Just for a second. But he stood. Was it real? Or am I clinging to illusions? I don't want to fail him again. Yet even as he whispered his fears, he knew something had changed. The house was no longer suffocating with silence. His son was no longer shrinking under fear. And Ava, this woman who had come into their lives by chance, had brought life back into a home that had been mourning for too long. The breakthrough came on an afternoon that began like any other. Ava had arranged the stars from Matthew's bed to the tall window overlooking the garden. The sun streamed in, the birds outside chirped, and soft soul music played in the background. Matthew sat in his wheelchair, his hands gripping the arms tightly, his face tense with both fear and determination. Ava knelt beside him, her voice calm and steady. Remember, warrior, you don't need to reach the last star. You only need to try for the first. If you fall, that's not failure. That's just another way of moving forward. Matthew nodded, swallowing hard. He looked at his father, who stood nearby, his eyes filled with unspoken encouragement. Daniel gave a small nod, his voice rough. I'm right here, son. With Ava's steady hand on his shoulder, Matthew pushed himself upright. His legs shook violently, but he stood, slowly, trembling. He leaned forward and brushed his foot against the first star sticker. His breath caught in his throat. He took another shaky step, reaching the second star. His arms flailed slightly, but Ava was there, steadying him with the gentlest touch. You're doing it, she whispered, her eyes shining. One star at a time, and then, as if something deep inside him finally broke free, Matthew pushed toward the third star. His knees nearly buckled, but he clenched his teeth, his small fists tightening. I can do it, he gasped. His right foot moved, then his left, each step a miracle. By the time he reached the fourth star, tears streamed down his face, but they were not tears of fear. They were tears of triumph. Daniel stood frozen, his hands pressed to his mouth, his eyes wide. He felt his chest tighten as he watched his son take those trembling steps. It was as if time itself had slowed, every heartbeat echoing in his ears. And when Matthew finally reached the last star, standing by the window, sunlight pouring over him, Daniel could no longer hold back. He rushed forward, dropping to his knees, his arms wrapping around his son. He wept openly, his tears soaking into Matthew's shoulder. You did it, son, he whispered, his voice breaking. You did the impossible. Matthew clung to him, sobbing but smiling. I walked, Dad. Miss Ava helped me walk. Ava stood back, her own tears streaming silently, her heart swelling with pride and relief. She knew this was only the beginning, that there would still be hard days, still be setbacks, but in this moment, the impossible had been made real. She pressed her notebook to her chest, whispering a silent prayer of thanks. News of Matthew's progress spread quickly among the Bennett family's circle. Friends, relatives, and even some of Daniel's business associates came to see the boy, who had once been written off as hopeless. They watched in awe as Matthew stood and took careful steps with Ava at his side. The doctors who had once said he would never walk again shook their heads in disbelief. Even Veronica, when she heard of it, dismissed it as a fluke, but deep down she knew she had been proven wrong. The greatest moment came weeks later, at a charity gala Daniel hosted for children's hospitals in memory of his late wife. The ballroom was filled with wealthy guests, investors, and community leaders. Daniel had kept Matthew away from such events since the accident, unwilling to let his son be pitied, but this time was different. With Ava's encouragement, he brought Matthew to the stage. The boy sat in his wheelchair at first, shy and uncertain under the bright lights, but Ava knelt beside him, whispering softly, "One star at a time, warrior. You don't need to prove anything. Just take one step for yourself." The music swelled, softly in the background, and the room grew silent as Matthew placed his hands on the armrests. He pushed himself up, his small body trembling, but his eyes were steady. Slowly he took a step, then another. The audience gasped, some covering their mouths, some wiping away tears. Daniel stood by his side, his hand hovering protectively, but not holding him, letting his son prove himself. Matthew walked across the stage, step by shaky step, until he reached the podium. He looked out at the crowd, his chest rising and falling with effort, and whispered into the microphone, "My mom wanted me to be happy. I think she's smiling now." The room erupted into applause, a thunder of clapping, cheers, and tears. Daniel pulled his son into his arms, his face wet with emotion. "You've made her proud, son. You've made us all proud." Ava stood, slightly to the side, her heart overflowing. She did not seek recognition, did not crave applause. All she needed was the sight of Matthew standing tall, his father embracing him, and the knowledge that love and patience had triumphed where force and money had failed. She opened her notebook and wrote one final line for the night. Day 30. Courage is walking into the light. From that day forward, the Bennett mansion was never the same. The silence that had once haunted its halls was replaced with laughter, music, and the steady rhythm of Matthew's footsteps growing stronger each day. Daniel, once a man trapped by fear and guilt, learned to let go, to trust not only science, but also the unmeasurable power of love. And Ava Johnson, the maid who had entered the mansion quietly with nothing but her hands, her heart, and her notebook, became the woman who had done what no doctor could. She had made the impossible possible. And for Matthew, the boy who had once whispered that he could not, the stars on the floor had become more than stickers. They were his journey, his map of victory, proof that even the smallest steps could lead to the brightest skies.